Here is the version of history that everybody agreed on. Elvis Presley arrived in 1956, shook his hips, and invented rock and roll.
Oh, I can't help falling in love with you.
Everything before him was a prologue. Everything after him was imitation. The crown belonged to one man, and the rest of the decade arranged itself accordingly. But that version has always been missing something. The truth is that the 1950s produced a generation of singers so extraordinarily gifted, so raw, so original, so genuinely dangerous that in any other circumstances, any one of them could have claimed the throne. Some of them were robbed of it by race, some by tragedy, some by a single catastrophic decision at exactly the wrong moment, some by an industry that took everything they had and handed the credit to someone else. These are 10 singers who should have been bigger than the king. 10. Eddie Cochran. Eddie Cochran wrote Summertime Blues at 19 years old, in a bedroom in Bell Gardens, California, in 1958, with his manager Jerry Capehart, and recorded it on a home 4-track he had built himself from salvaged parts. Nobody his age was self-producing records in 1958. Nobody was multi-tracking guitar overdubs at home. Nobody was writing songs with the specific compressed teenage fury that Cochran packed into 2 minutes and 42 seconds of pure frustration, an employer who won't give you time off, a congressman who doesn't care, a father who simply says no. Summertime Blues reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 18 in the UK in the summer of 1958, and Pete Townshend later called it the first song that made him understand what rock and roll was actually for.
No doubt, son, you gotta work late. Sometimes I wonder, but
John Lennon listed Cochran among his primary influences. Bruce Springsteen covered him. The Who's very first single was a cover of his Bald-Headed Woman. On April 17, 1960, a taxi carrying Cochran, Gene Vincent, and Sharon Sheeley to London Airport blew a tire and crashed in Chippenham, England. Cochran was thrown through the windscreen. He died the following day in Bath. He was 21 years old. Sometimes the most important career in rock and roll is the one that never got to finish. 9. Gene Vincent. Capitol Records signed Gene Vincent in 1956 specifically because they wanted their own Elvis, a white Southern boy with a voice and a swagger who could compete with Sun Records' rising star. What they got was something they hadn't bargained for. Vincent recorded Bebop-A-Lula in a single take at Owen Bradley's studio in Nashville in May 1956. And the resulting record was so convincing in its Presley-esque intensity
Bebop-A-Lula, she's my baby. Bebop-A-Lula, I don't need.
that Elvis's own mother called Sun Records to ask if it was her son. It was not. It was a 21-year-old from Norfolk, Virginia, with a leg brace from a motorcycle accident, performing through permanent pain with a reckless, desperate physical energy that nobody else on the American stage could match. Bebop-A-Lula reached number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 16 in the UK in the summer of 1956. In Britain, Vincent was a superstar worshipped by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who adopted his leather-clad image wholesale, and by Ian Dury, who wrote an entire song in his honor. In America, he was a footnote. Capitol Records didn't know what to do with him, released his records without strategy, and watched his commercial moment pass. He died of a bleeding ulcer in 1971 at 36, broke and largely forgotten in his own country. Sometimes the prophet is never recognized in his homeland. 8. Fats Domino. Antoine Domino sold 65 million records in the 1950s, more than any other artist in the decade except Elvis Presley. He had been recording for Imperial Records since 1949, building a catalog of New Orleans boogie-woogie piano hits that were selling in the hundreds of thousands before Elvis had cut his first record. Blueberry Hill reached number 1 on the R&B chart and number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1956, outselling almost everything else on radio that autumn. John Lennon listed Domino among the most important figures in rock and roll history. Paul McCartney's left-hand piano bass style was directly and openly modeled on Domino's rolling, percussive technique. Despite all of this, the sales figures, the influence, The undeniable commercial dominance Domino was consistently framed as a regional R&B act rather than a rock and roll pioneer, a distinction driven entirely by the color of his skin and the geography of his origin. Concert promoters in the American South refused to book integrated shows. Radio programmers categorized his records as rhythm and blues rather than pop, limiting their chart reach. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. Paul McCartney visited him in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina to make sure he was alive. Sometimes the most important pianist in rock and roll history is the one the textbook puts in the footnotes. 7. Chuck Berry. Keith Richards said it plainly and has never walked it back. If you had tried to give rock and roll another name, you might have called it Chuck Berry. Berry invented the guitar riff, wrote the lyrical template of teenage rebellion and joy that every rock songwriter since has borrowed from, choreographed the duck walk, and produced a catalog of original compositions: Johnny B. Good, Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, Sweet Little 16, rock and roll music that Elvis Presley, who recorded none of his own material, could not come close to matching as a writer. John Lennon said Berry was the one. The Beatles covered him repeatedly. The Rolling Stones built their early career on his songs. And yet, in 1959, Berry was arrested under the Mann Act for transporting a 14-year-old Apache waitress named Janice Escalante across state lines. The first trial was declared a mistrial after the judge made openly racist remarks from the bench. The second ended in conviction. Berry served 18 months in federal prison between 1962 and 1963. Missing the entire early surge of the British invasion, a movement that had been built almost entirely on his foundation.
I started walking toward a coffee-colored Cadillac, pushing through the crowd, trying to get to where she's at. Campaign shout.
He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a first-class member in 1986. Sometimes the man who builds the house is the last one invited inside. 6. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke had been the lead singer of the Soul Stirrers, the most celebrated gospel group in America, before he crossed over to pop in 1957 with You Send Me, a song he wrote himself, which hit #1 on both the Billboard Hot 100 and the R&B charts simultaneously, and sold nearly 2 million copies in its first months of release. Then he did something no black artist had done before. He built his own infrastructure. SAR Records, his own label. Cags Music, his own publishing company.
Twisting the night away. He's a man in evening.
His own management. His own touring operation. He understood, with precise and unsentimental clarity, that the only way a black artist in 1950s and 1960s America could retain the rewards of his own talent was to own the machinery that distributed it. He was 33 years old and had barely started. A Change Is Gonna Come, written after he was turned away from a Holiday Inn in Louisiana for being black. Recorded in 1963 and released as a single in 1964, is considered by many historians the most important American song of the 20th century. On December 11, 1964, he was shot and killed at a motel in Los Angeles under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Sometimes the most important business mind in the history of popular music is the one the history books remember only as a voice. 5. Jerry Lee Lewis. Sam Phillips worked with Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Roy Orbison. He said Jerry Lee Lewis was the most talented artist he had ever encountered. Not the most famous, the most talented. Lewis walked into Sun's studio in the autumn of 1956, sat down at the piano, and played with a ferocity and technical command that stopped everyone in the room. Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On was recorded in a few takes in February 1957, banned immediately from radio for being too sexually explicit, and sold 6 million copies anyway, hitting #1 on the pop, country, and R&B charts simultaneously, a trifecta that nobody before or since has achieved with a debut single. Great Balls of Fire followed and sold even faster. Lewis performed live with a physical recklessness that made Elvis's hip movements look choreographed, kicking the piano bench away, playing standing up, once setting the instrument on fire. Then, in May 1958, he flew to London for a British tour and brought his wife. His wife was Myra Gale Brown, 13 years old, the daughter of his bass player, his second cousin once removed. A journalist discovered this at the airport press conference. The tour was canceled before it began. Radio stations pulled his records. He went from $10,000 a night to barely $100. Sometimes one press conference is enough to end everything. 4. Big Mama Thornton. Willie Mae Thornton recorded Hound Dog in August 1952 at Radio Recorders in Los Angeles, backed by Johnny Otis's band, with a vocal performance so ferocious and so physically commanding that the musicians in the room reportedly fell silent when she finished the first take. The song was written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, two 19-year-old Jewish songwriters from Los Angeles who had written it specifically for her voice, her size, her presence, and her authority. It hit number 1 on the Billboard R&B chart in March 1953 and stayed there for 7 weeks, selling nearly 500,000 copies. Thornton received a flat fee of $500 and no royalties. 3 years later, Elvis Presley recorded his own version, rearranged it into something considerably less threatening, released it as a double A-side with Don't Be Cruel, and watched it sell 10 million copies and spend 11 weeks at number 1. She also wrote Ball and Chain in 1961, recorded it, and watched her label refuse to release it. Janis Joplin recorded it in 1967, and it made her famous. Big Mama Thornton died in 1984 with less than $500 in her bank account. She was ranked the most underrated rock artist of all time by Collider in 2023. Sometimes the person who built the foundation is the last one to get a room in the house. 3. Buddy Holly. Paul McCartney said it as plainly as it has ever been said. John and I started writing our own songs because of Buddy Holly. It was like, wow, he writes and performs and plays guitar. You could do all of it yourself. The Beatles named themselves after Holly's Crickets. Their very first recording session as the Quarrymen in 1958 was a cover of That'll Be the Day. The Rolling Stones had their first UK Top 10 single with a Holly cover in 1964. Holly was the first rock and roll artist to write his own songs, play his own guitar parts, produce his own records.
That'll be the day when you say goodbye. Yes, that'll be the day when you make me cry.
And negotiate ownership of his own publishing years before anyone else in rock and roll had thought to do any of it. That'll Be the Day hit number 1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom in September 1957. Peggy Sue followed. Oh Boy, Maybe Baby, Rave On, each one a template that the next decade built on. Holly was 22 years old and had been a national recording artist for 18 months when the chartered plane he was riding in went down in a cornfield near Clear Lake, Iowa. In the early hours of February 3, 1959, Don McLean called it the day the music died. He was right. Sometimes the most important musician who ever lived never got to finish what he started. 2. Roy Orbison. In June 1963, Roy Orbison co-headlined a British tour with the Beatles. The Beatles were supposed to be the headliners. By the second night, Orbison was getting 14 encores, and the Beatles voluntarily gave him the closing spot. John Lennon and Paul McCartney stood in the wings every night and watched. His voice did things that neither of them could explain.
Dum 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 dum
A 3-octave range deployed with operatic precision, moving from a whisper to a sustained falsetto climax with no audible effort and no apparent limit. Only The Lonely had reached number 2 in the United States and number 1 in the UK in 1960. Running Scared hit number 1 in America in 1961 with a single climactic high note at the end that Orbison held until the record simply stopped. Oh, Pretty Woman hit number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic in 1964, displaced the Beatles at the top of the US chart, and sold 7 million copies, making it one of the best-selling singles in history. Then, his wife Claudette was killed by a truck while riding her motorcycle in June 1966. Then, his 2 oldest sons died in a house fire in September 1968 while he was on tour. He rebuilt himself slowly, across decades, quietly influencing every singer who valued control and vulnerability in equal measure. 1. Little Richard. In October 1957, At the absolute peak of his commercial power, 7 consecutive top 10 hits, sold-out tours, film appearances, a level of fame that was beginning to rival Elvis's own Little Richard, looked out the window of a plane over Australia, saw what he later described as a ball of fire in the sky, and interpreted it as a sign from God. He threw his rings into Sydney Harbor the following morning, enrolled in an Alabama Bible college, and walked away from rock and roll entirely. He was 24 years old. What he left behind was the most consequential body of work any performer had assembled in the first 3 years of the rock era. A catalog that Elvis borrowed from, that Pat Boone sanitized for the white pop market, that the Beatles studied with the devotion of apprentices. Tutti Frutti in 1955. Long Tall Sally in 1956, recorded at such a reckless tempo that Little Richard later admitted he had specifically designed it to be impossible for Pat Boone to cover. Boone covered it anyway. Both versions sold 1 million copies. The industry gave Boone the pop chart and Richard the R&B chart, a division that had everything to do with race and nothing to do with the music. Elton John said Little Richard was his entire reason for becoming a musician. Otis Redding said he would not have existed without him. Elvis was extraordinary. His talent, his timing, his cultural impact, none of it is in dispute. But he didn't build this alone. He stood on the shoulders of 10 singers who deserved equal credit and received a fraction of it. Which one of these should history remember more loudly? Drop your answer in the comments and subscribe for more music history that almost got buried.